They thought they were clever. They thought they had me cornered. My own children, the ones I carried, raised, and sacrificed for, sat in my living room, right there on my furniture in my house, speaking as if I weren't even in the room. Their voices were calm, too calm, the kind of calm you only hear when a plan has been rehearsed over and over again. I sat there in silence, my hands folded neatly in my lap, watching. I knew better than to interrupt. If there's one thing I've learned in my 76 years on this earth, it's that when people believe they've won, they show you who they really are. And oh, did my children show me. It started a week before, when I caught the tail end of their whispers. My hearing isn't what it used to be, but it's sharper than they think. I was coming down the hallway late at night when I heard them in the kitchen. "She won't fight it," my son murmured. "Of course she won't," my daughter whispered back, her voice tight with excitement. "What can she do? She's old, she doesn't have the strength, and even if she tried, no one would believe her. We'll sell the house, transfer the accounts, and put her somewhere safe. She'll have a bed, food, nurses. It's more than enough." If that was the word she used. They weren't talking about safety. They were talking about control. I leaned against the wall, my heart thudding in my chest. Every part of me wanted to burst into that kitchen and demand answers. But I didn't. Not that night. I stayed quiet, let them keep talking, let them lay their plan bare. "It'll be perfect," my son said finally, with that smug tone that always made me want to wash his mouth out with soap, even as a boy. "She'll be taken care of, and we'll finally get to enjoy life." 2.1 million, split right down the middle. They laughed softly, and I stood there in the dark, clutching the wall for support, feeling the sting of betrayal seep into my bones. Now, 1 week later, I sat across from them in my own living room. They had called me here like some kind of family meeting, as though I were the child and they were the parents. My son cleared his throat. He always did that when he was about to say something rehearsed. "Mom," he began, voice smooth and careful, "we've been talking. You know we love you, right?" I raised an eyebrow. Love. Funny way of showing it. My daughter jumped in, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "We just want what's best for you. You've done so much for us, you've worked so hard, and now it's time for you to relax. To not worry about bills or the house or responsibilities. We want you to be safe." Again, that cursed word. They talked and talked, circling around the truth, dressing their betrayal in soft, sugary words. But the more they spoke, the clearer it became. They had already made decisions. They had already taken steps. My house, the very one I was sitting in, was being prepared for sale. My accounts had already been touched. They thought I didn't notice the missing transactions, the sudden maintenance fees that weren't mine. And the final touch. They had found a nursing home. A home they described as comfortable and modern, with nurses and staff to look after me. But I knew what it really meant. A place to put me away, to silence me while they enjoyed the wealth I had built with my late husband, with my own 2 hands, with decades of sacrifice. I listened. He nodded. I let them speak. But inside my heart was a furnace. The pride that blinded them. Do you know what struck me the most that day? It wasn't just their words. It wasn't even their plan. It was the pride on their faces. They were proud of themselves. Like schemers who thought they'd crafted a flawless crime. My son leaned back in the armchair that once belonged to his father. His smirk practically etched into his skin. He thought he looked like a man in control, but all I saw was a boy who had lost his way. My daughter's face was harder to read. Her lips pressed into a line, but her eyes glittered with triumph. She wanted to appear conflicted, but she wasn't. She was just as eager as her brother. They believed they were brilliant. They believed they had won. They believed I was powerless. And that belief was their biggest mistake. Because I knew something they didn't. Something that had been sitting quietly, tucked away where only I could reach it. When they finished their little speech, when they looked at me with those false sympathetic eyes, waiting for me to nod and thank them for their betrayal, I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. Instead, I reached into my bag. Their eyes followed my hand, curious, then wary. Slowly, I pulled out a plain brown folder and placed it on the coffee table between us. Neither of them moved. "What's that?" my son asked finally, suspicion creeping into his voice. I didn't answer. I simply folded my hands in my lap, leaned back in my chair and smiled. The silence stretched. My daughter leaned forward, her fingers twitching. "Mom, what is this?" I still didn't answer. I let the weight of that folder sit there like a shadow, like a ticking clock, like a truth waiting to explode. They thought their plan was perfect. They thought they had me beaten. But they hadn't considered one thing. And as they stared at that folder, their perfect little world began to crack. I sat there in my chair, my back straight, my hands folded neatly, as though I were listening to a sermon at church. But my heart wasn't still. Oh no. Inside me was a storm. A storm made of years of sacrifice, of nights gone hungry so my children could eat, of hours upon hours spent working 2 jobs, of every wrinkle etched into my skin from worry and toil. And now those very children, the ones I had built this life for, were plotting to strip it all away. They thought I didn't know. But I had heard them. It was a frosty Tuesday evening. The kind where the Arizona air dips lower than you'd expect, sharp and biting, making the windows fog. I had woken from a light nap in my chair, the same chair I was sitting in now, and I went to the kitchen for some water. That's when I heard them. My son's voice, low but not low enough. "We'll have to move quickly. The longer we wait, the harder it'll be. She'll notice the withdrawals." My daughter's reply, her voice clipped, almost impatient. "Don't worry about that. She doesn't understand online banking, she barely checks her account. By the time she realizes, it'll be too late." I froze in the hallway, the old wooden floor creaking under my slippers. I pressed myself against the wall, straining to hear. "She's stubborn," my son muttered. "If she resists, we'll need paperwork ready. Medical evaluations, something to prove she can't live alone." My stomach twisted. Medical evaluations. Proof I couldn't live alone. I cooked my meals, cleaned my home, paid my bills. My mind was sharper than theirs on most days. But they were ready to paint me as incapable, just so they could get their hands on money they hadn't earned. Then came the sentence that seared itself into my memory. "We'll split it down the middle. 2.1 million. Can you imagine? We'll finally live the way we deserve." Deserve. I almost gasped aloud. Deserve. And what had I deserved all these years? Scrubbing floors, waiting tables, saving every penny so that my children could go to good schools, wear nice clothes, eat 3 meals a day. They deserved my sacrifice, but they thought they deserved my reward. That was the night the seed of my plan took root. That folder in my bag wasn't just paper. It was decades of careful planning, of foresight, of love and wisdom preserved by a woman they had so underestimated. It was my answer, my weapon, my shield. And soon they would see it. The day everything shifted didn't start with thunder or lightning, or even some dramatic knock on the door. It began quietly, almost too quietly, the kind of day where you think nothing remarkable will ever happen. But, looking back, I suppose the most ordinary mornings often birth the most extraordinary storms. I was sitting in the small lounge area of the nursing home, my knitting needles clicking softly as the television droned in the background. A rerun of some old detective show played, the kind my late husband and I used to watch together. I wasn't really paying attention, though. My mind kept drifting back to the faces of my children the last time I saw them. The smirks, the satisfaction, the way they patted each other on the back like victorious generals after a battle. They thought they'd won. They had stripped me of my dignity, my home, and my freedom. But what they didn't know was that I wasn't as powerless as I let them believe. That's the thing about growing older. People mistake silence for weakness. They see wrinkles and white hair and think time has drained you of all sharpness, all fight, all cunning. They don't realize that silence can be armor, that patience can be a weapon sharper than any blade. I'd been silent that day in the lawyer's office when they shoved papers under my nose, telling me it was for my own good. I'd been silent when the movers carted my belongings away, piece by piece, until my house echoed with emptiness. I'd even been silent when they drove me here, as though they were shepherds delivering livestock to its final pen. But silence is not surrender. Noah's silence was my shield. And tucked away, deep inside the old leather folder resting in my dresser drawer, was the sword. That folder. Oh, how heavy it felt the first time I held it after everything happened. Heavy not just with paper but with truth, with fire, with a kind of power that can topple even the proudest of thrones. It had been in my possession long before my children began plotting. I had kept it safe, untouched, knowing that someday it might be needed. That someday had arrived. I remember the night I decided. The cold seeped in through the cracks of my window, the kind of winter chill that aches in old bones. I wrapped myself in a quilt and stared at the ceiling, unable to sleep. My children's laughter echoed in my ears, haunting me, mocking me. "They'll never respect you again," a voice inside me whispered. "Not unless you remind them who you are." So I rose from bed, shuffled over to the dresser, and pulled out the folder. My hands trembled as I opened it, but not from weakness. No, it was from anticipation. From the knowledge that once I set this plan into motion, there was no turning back. Inside that folder were documents my children had never seen. Contracts, amendments, letters signed and notarized. Things their lawyer, sharp as he thought he was, had overlooked. My son always bragged about how airtight his legal team was, how nothing could slip past them. But oh, how blind arrogance makes a man. He never thought his mother, his aging, quiet, harmless mother, could outmaneuver him. But I had. I didn't need strength in my body. I had strength in my mind. And in that moment, as I stared down at the words on those pages, I knew I was about to reclaim everything they had stolen. The next morning I made the call. I still remember how the phone felt in my hand. Cold, heavy, like I was gripping the very key to my freedom. I dialed the number from memory, though it had been years since I'd last used it. And when the voice on the other end answered, deep and familiar, my heart steadied. "It's time," I said simply. There was silence for a moment, then a low chuckle. "I wondered how long it would take before you called." That was all. No explanations, no small talk. He understood. The wheels were in motion. Days passed. My children didn't suspect a thing. They still visited occasionally, smug and self-assured, dropping by to gloat more than to check on me. They'd lean in the doorway of my room, arms crossed, asking in sickly sweet voices, "How are you settling in, Mom?" As though they hadn't torn my life apart with their own hands. I'd smile softly, nodding, never giving them the satisfaction of my anger. Oh, how that baffled them. They expected tears, rage, begging. But I gave them none of it. My silence unnerved them more than any shouting ever could. And all the while, the plan unfolded quietly behind the scenes. One afternoon, I sat in the lounge again, watching as the sunlight streamed through the window, painting golden patterns across the carpet. My knitting lay untouched in my lap. My heart beat faster than it had in years, because I knew what was coming. That was the day the envelope arrived. Thick, sealed, official. It was slipped discreetly into my hands by a trusted courier, one who had been instructed to bypass the usual channels. I held it close, my fingers tracing the edge, and for the first time in a long while I felt alive. Inside that envelope was the proof. The undeniable, inescapable proof that everything my children thought they controlled was about to crumble. I tucked it away carefully, biding my time. The confrontation came sooner than I expected. My son and daughter showed up together, their faces flushed with self-importance, their words dripping with condescension. "We've made some adjustments, Mom," my son said, tossing a stack of papers onto my bedside table. "For your safety, of course. You don't need to worry about anything. We're handling it all." I looked at the papers, then back at him, and I smiled. Not the weak smile they were used to, but something sharper. Something that made my daughter shift uncomfortably. "What's so funny?" she snapped. "Nothing," I said softly, reaching into the drawer and pulling out the folder. Their eyes followed the motion, confusion flickering across their faces. They weren't used to me doing anything unexpected. To them I was predictable, manageable, but not today. I placed the folder on the table beside their stack of papers and tapped it gently. You might want to read these before you get too comfortable. My son frowned, flipping it open carelessly at first, then pausing as his eyes scanned the words. His smugness faltered. His jaw tightened. My daughter leaned over his shoulder, reading, and within seconds her face went pale. "What is this?" she demanded. "Protection," I replied calmly. "Mine and yours, though you were too foolish to realize it." They shuffled through the pages, their hands growing frantic, their voices rising. My son muttered curses under his breath, while my daughter kept shaking her head as though denial could erase ink from paper. This can't be real," my son stammered. "Oh, it's real," I said, leaning back in my chair. "More real than the lies you fed me. More binding than the tricks you tried to play. You thought you were clever, but you forgot one thing: I raised you. And I know every weakness you carry, every blind spot in your so-called genius." They started to argue then, not with me but with each other. Accusations flew, voices cracked, the room filled with chaos. I simply watched. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt in control again. The power wasn't in their hands anymore. It was back in mine. And they knew it. Their lawyer hadn't seen the documents. They hadn't anticipated the clauses, the protections, the contingencies I had quietly arranged years ago. The house, the accounts, the investments, they weren't theirs to plunder after all. And when they realized it, when the full weight of their failure sank in, they screamed. Oh, how they screamed. Their voices echoed down the hallway, drawing curious glances from nurses and residents alike. But I just sat there, serene, as though I were listening to a symphony composed especially for me. Because in a way that was the sound of justice. That was the sound of children who had thought themselves predators, realizing they had been prey all along. And I, an old woman in a nursing home, dismissed and discarded, was the hunter who had caught them. I sat in that quiet room, folder still resting heavy on my lap, though the real weight was no longer in the papers. It was in the silence that followed their screams. You see, when people think they've won, when they think they've stripped you of everything, their arrogance blinds them. They stop checking the fine print, they stop worrying about consequences, and that is when they make their biggest mistakes. I had watched my son and his wife preen like peacocks, strutting around with the thought that their plan was perfect. Take my $2.1 million, sign the papers, shove me in this nursing home and call it done. To them I was already buried. Just an old woman wasting air. But I had learned something in my long life. The moment you're underestimated is the moment you hold the most power. I didn't fight them when they waved contracts in my face. I didn't cry when they pushed my suitcase through that sterile hallway. I didn't even flinch when they whispered how easy it was to get rid of me. I simply smiled, nodded, and let them believe. My silence was not surrender. It was strategy. And so, I sat there, in the middle of their chaos after handing over that folder. They thought it was just paper. They had no idea it was a grenade with the pin already pulled. That folder held my trump card, something they could never undo, no matter how clever they thought they were. And the beauty of it was, they had handed me the perfect stage. I didn't need to chase them anymore. They had delivered themselves into my hands, proudly walking into the trap I had set years before they ever dreamed of betrayal. I remembered the day I first prepared it, long before the thought of being shoved into a nursing home ever crossed my mind. My husband used to say, "A smart woman keeps a backup for the backup." And so I did. I had worked with an old lawyer friend, a man who believed in me when others thought I was too cautious. Together we created not just a will, not just a trust, but a web of protection so intricate that any hand trying to grab what was mine would end up caught, tangled, and exposed. It wasn't just about the money, it was about the principle. It was about teaching them that betrayal has a cost. I leaned back in that stiff chair, watching them unravel. My son's face turned red, veins rising on his neck as he shouted at his wife, as though this was suddenly her fault. She, of course, threw it back at him, her voice high-pitched and trembling, claiming she only did what he wanted. The two of them tore into each other right there, not realizing how small they looked, how ugly. I had spent years feeding them, nurturing them, loving them. And here they were, tearing each other apart over something they thought was already theirs. It was almost poetic. But here's the part that burned into my memory the most. The moment when my son, this man I carried for 9 long months, raised from a boy to adulthood, the same boy who once held my hand at the doctor's office when I was sick, looked at me with eyes so full of venom I barely recognized him. He pointed a finger, trembling with rage, and spat out words I will never forget. "You ruined everything. You had nothing left, and still, you found a way to destroy us." And I smiled. Not because I was proud of the destruction, but because for once he understood. I wasn't powerless. I wasn't the frail, disposable mother he thought he could toss aside. I was still here. And I had more strength than he ever imagined. The truth was, the folder he held contained the updated will, the one they never knew existed. It stripped them of every penny, every asset they thought they had stolen. Instead, it redirected everything into a foundation I had set up quietly, in honor of the very man whose memory they had trampled. My late husband. A foundation that would help children from broken homes, kids cast aside by families who didn't want them. My son and his wife had no place in it. Their names were erased as though they never existed in my financial world. I could see the reality sinking in as they flipped through the documents, realizing that their signatures, their smug handshakes, their laughter at my expense, it was all worthless. They hadn't won. They had played themselves. Now you may think that was enough for me. To watch them squirm, to see their empire of lies crumble. But no. That was just the beginning. Because in betrayal this deep, you don't just let the traitors walk away with lessons. They walk away with scars. I had taken notes on every lie they told, every trick they used, every false signature they pushed in front of me. And with that one phone call I made from the nursing home, a single call to my lawyer, they had no idea their so-called victory was already a criminal case in motion. Fraud, coercion, elder abuse. Oh, the list was long and the evidence was airtight. And there was something delicious in knowing that the very house they were so proud of selling, the very bank account they had emptied for their vacations, their designer clothes, their smug dinners with friends, all of it would soon be seized. They hadn't just failed to steal from me. They had stolen from themselves. I leaned forward in my chair, watching them through narrowed eyes, and I thought, this is what justice looks like when it wears the face of patience. They wanted me gone. They wanted me silenced. But instead they had given me the microphone, and the world was about to hear my story. I watched them crumble in front of me, and for a brief moment, I almost pitied them. Almost. Because no matter how much my heart wanted to soften, my memory would not let me forget the nights they plotted against me. The whispers I overheard behind closed doors. The laughter when they thought I was too weak to hear. The deliberate cruelty of changing the locks while I was still inside the house I built with my own hands. No, pity had no place here. You see, betrayal doesn't strike all at once. It's not a knife to the chest, clean and final. Betrayal is slow. It festers. It starts with little things. The dismissive comments, the rolling eyes, the accidental exclusions. And then, like water wearing down stone, it shapes your world until one day you realize you've been carved into nothing. That's what they did to me, piece by piece, until I decided the carving was over. That night, as they stood in my room, screaming over the folder, I thought back to the very first sign that my son was slipping away from me. He must have been 13, maybe 14. He came home with anger burning in his eyes, slamming doors, muttering that I didn't understand. I thought it was just adolescence. But adolescence should pass. His bitterness did not. And when he married her, his wife, that sharp-tongued woman who never once looked me in the eye with respect, it was as though the last thread holding him to me was cut. Still I stayed silent, cooked meals. I watched their children when asked. I gave them space when they rolled their eyes. I swallowed my pride when they made jokes at my expense. All because I told myself, family is family. You endure it. But family does not sell your house behind your back. Family does not trick you into signatures. Family does not smile while plotting to exile you to a nursing home. stripping away every piece of dignity you spent a lifetime building. That night, in that cold, clinical room, I promised myself, this was not the end of my story. It was the beginning of theirs. My son's wife was the first to break. She dropped onto the edge of the bed, clutching the folder as though squeezing the papers tighter might change the words printed on them. Her mascara smeared down her cheeks, her hands trembling. This isn't legal," she stammered. She can't do this. But I could. And I did. My son snatched the folder from her, rifling through it, his lips moving as he read silently, his face growing paler with every line. He slammed the papers shut, then turned to me, his voice shaking. You planned this all along, didn't you?" I looked him dead in the eyes and said very calmly, "Yes." He staggered back, as though the truth itself had weight enough to knock him off balance. And that was when I realized, the power wasn't just in the folder or the money or the will. The power was in the fact that I had been patient while they underestimated me. I had let them believe their own lies. And now, the truth was a knife sharper than anything I could have wielded myself. I wanted to tell him everything in that moment. Every long night I sat awake, thinking about how to protect myself. Every time I pretended not to hear his cruel words, just so I could gather one more piece of evidence. Every ounce of strength it took to keep my face neutral while he forced that pen into my hand. But I didn't. Instead, I let the silence grow. Because silence is the loudest weapon of all. And then, slowly, I began to speak. Not loud, not fast, but with each word landing like a hammer. You thought you were clever. You thought you could take from me, hide me away, erase me. But the truth is, I've been 3 steps ahead of you this whole time. And now, the very ground you walk on is gone. My son's wife sobbed, clutching her hair. My son cursed under his breath, pacing the room like a trapped animal. They had expected tears. They had expected me to beg. They had expected weakness. What they got instead was a woman who had finally decided enough was enough. And then came the sound, the knock at the door. The timing was perfect, almost divine. Because when that door opened, and the attorney walked in, briefcase in hand, I saw the blood drain from their faces. They hadn't expected witnesses. They hadn't expected anyone else to see their unraveling. But I had made sure of it. The attorney, a man with silver hair and a gaze that could cut steel, set his briefcase on the small table and clicked it open. "Shall we begin?" he asked, as though this were any other appointment. My son tried to object, shouting that it was a private matter, that this was family business. But the attorney only raised a brow and said, "Fraud is not a family business, sir. It's a legal one." The air grew thick. My son's wife buried her face in her hands. No. I simply sat back, folded my hands in my lap, and watched the beginning of their end. Because the truth was, I wasn't just reclaiming my money. I was reclaiming my dignity, my voice, my power. For years I had been silent. For years I had endured. But no more. They had thought their plan was perfect. They thought they'd won. And now, they were about to learn that the woman they dismissed as weak, fragile, disposable, was the very woman who would dismantle their lives piece by piece. I smiled again, not because I was cruel but because I was free. And freedom, after betrayal, is the sweetest revenge of all. The room felt heavier with every passing second. My son stood frozen. His fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. His wife was muttering under her breath, rocking slightly, as though if she repeated her denials often enough, the truth might magically rewrite itself. But the truth doesn't bend. The truth stands tall, even when people spend their lives trying to bury it. The attorney adjusted his glasses and began removing papers from his briefcase, laying them carefully on the small hospital table as though arranging weapons for battle. Each page slid against the surface with a soft hiss, but to my son, it must have sounded like thunder. "This," the attorney said calmly, tapping the first document, "is the forensic analysis of the signatures. As you can see, the notary's testimony matches the handwriting expert's report. These signatures were coerced and obtained under duress. Invalid. My son tried to lunge forward, tried to grab the paper, but the attorney's hand was quicker. Touch this, and I'll have you removed from the building, he warned, his voice like steel. My son froze, his chest heaving. For the first time in decades, I saw the boy he used to be. The boy who always wanted to win, who couldn't bear to lose. But this time, losing wasn't just about a game or an argument. This was about his future, his reputation, his freedom. And then the attorney pulled out the second document. This, he said, is the transfer of ownership you attempted. Illegal. Fraudulent. And with enough evidence behind it to see you both in court before the month ends. My son's wife let out a sharp cry, her voice cracking. You can't do this to us. We're family. You can't just. But the attorney silenced her with a single glance. She, he said firmly, pointing at me, is the only family in this room who honored her responsibilities. You tried to erase her. And now you expect compassion. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for water. She had no reply. I stayed silent. It wasn't my battle to fight anymore. Not with words, at least. I had already said enough. Now it was about watching the truth unravel them. And oh, how it unraveled. The attorney pulled out the third document, the one I had hidden away like a secret weapon. It wasn't about the money, not directly. It was about the will. The true will. This, he said, his voice slow and deliberate, is the updated estate plan. It was finalized last year, long before these manipulations began. Every cent, every asset, every piece of property remains under her control. And if she passes, he paused, letting the silence stretch until it stung, not a single penny goes to either of you. The room erupted. My son's wife let out a wail so shrill it cut through the sterile hospital air. She clutched at his arm, shaking him, sobbing into his shoulder. We can't, no. No, this isn't fair. My son, however, went utterly still. His face turned the color of ash. His lips pressed into a thin line. His eyes locked onto mine. And in them I saw it. The realization that all his careful planning, all his arrogance, all his cruelty, had collapsed into nothing. And still I said nothing. I simply leaned back against my pillow, folded my hands, and let him stare at me. Let him see the calm in my face while his world burned. Because the truth was, he thought this was about money. He thought the $2.1 million was the prize. But no. The real victory was this moment. Watching him realize that no matter how strong his schemes, no matter how perfect his plan seemed, I had undone it with patience, silence, and strategy. The attorney continued, his voice calm but firm. In fact, she has arranged that upon her passing, her estate will be divided among charitable organizations and trust funds for her grandchildren. Not a cent directly accessible to you. That was the final blow. My son's wife collapsed to the floor, sobbing so loudly the nurses rushed in. My son didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, staring at me with eyes full of fire and disbelief. Why? He finally whispered, his voice hoarse. Why would you do this to me? And that was the question that broke me. Not because I doubted my choices, but because he still didn't see. After everything, after every betrayal, after every night I cried myself to sleep wondering where I had gone wrong, he still thought he was the victim. I felt my throat tighten, but I forced the tears back. Not here. Not now. You did this to yourself, I said softly. You forgot who raised you. You forgot who fed you when you were hungry, who stayed up all night when you were sick, who sacrificed everything so you could have a life better than mine. You forgot. And you tried to erase me. That was your choice. And these are the consequences. He flinched as though I'd struck him. And for the first time, I saw doubt flicker across his face. Just a flicker, but it was there. The attorney began gathering his papers, closing the briefcase with a sharp snap. We'll be in touch, he said briskly. I'll handle the filings. You needn't worry, ma'am. He nodded to me with respect, then glanced at them with cold disdain. You should get yourselves legal counsel. And with that he was gone. The silence left in his wake was deafening. I looked at my son and his wife. Two people who had once believed they held my life in their hands. Now they couldn't even hold themselves together. Finally I spoke one last time. I warned you once. Do you remember? I told you greed destroys everything it touches. You didn't listen. And now? I let the words hang unfinished, because the truth didn't need me to finish it. They knew. They both knew. I turned my face to the window, ignoring their sobs, their whispered curses, their broken voices. I didn't need to watch them anymore. My battle was over, and for the first time in years I felt peace. The silence after the lawyer left was not ordinary silence. It wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, suffocating, almost alive. It pressed against the walls, pressed against their chests, pressed against my ears until I could hear nothing but the ragged sound of their breathing. My son didn't speak. His wife's sobs echoed in uneven waves, breaking the air into sharp fragments. The nurses had long since left, shaking their heads, whispering to each other about greedy families, and poor old women who deserve better. I wanted to feel pity for them. I truly did. But pity is earned by humility, not arrogance. And the two of them had none. I kept my face turned toward the window, watching as the clouds outside moved slowly across the pale sky. It was the middle of winter, yet the sun still fought to break through, spilling slivers of light onto the frosted glass. To me, that light felt like a sign, faint but steady, that I had done what needed to be done. Then finally his voice broke the silence. You destroyed me. The words were low, almost a growl, but every syllable carried weight. I didn't look at him. No, I said softly. You destroyed yourself. He slammed his hand against the foot of my hospital bed, rattling the metal frame. His wife gasped and tried to calm him, but he shoved her off with a jerk of his arm. Don't you dare lecture me. Don't you dare pretend this is my fault. You had everything, and you took it all away from me. At that, I turned my head slowly and looked him dead in the eye. My son. My flesh and blood. And yet, in that moment, I saw nothing of the child I once held against my chest, the boy I had cheered for at school plays, the teenager I had prayed for every night when he stumbled home drunk. You wanted everything, I whispered. And you thought you could get it by pushing me aside. But you forgot one thing. His jaw clenched. What? You forgot who I am. He froze. For a moment I thought he would strike me. His face twisted with rage, his fists shook. His whole body trembled like a storm contained in too small a space. But then, the fire dimmed. He stepped back, his breath uneven, and for just a flicker of a second I saw fear. Not fear of me, perhaps, but fear of what he had become. His wife, however, was not so shaken. She wiped her tears roughly and straightened her back. We're not giving up, she spat. You think you've won, but we'll fight this. We'll drag this through court for years if we have to. We'll ruin you with lawyers and appeals. You'll see. You'll die before this is over, and when you do... Her voice broke into a bitter laugh. We'll get everything. That laugh. That cruel, shrill laugh. It cut through me more than my son's anger ever could. Because in her, I saw no trace of love. No trace of family. Only greed sharpened into a blade. I let her words hang in the air, but deep inside, I was already smiling. Because what she didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that I had planned for this too. The lawyer hadn't revealed everything. Not yet. He had shared just enough to shake them, just enough to crush their arrogance. The rest of the truth, the part still hidden safely in that folder, would hit them later. And when it did, their screams would echo far louder than the ones I'd heard today. I leaned forward slightly, my voice steady. You think this is about money, but money comes and goes. What you've lost can never be bought back. She sneered. And what's that? Me. The words landed like stones. She blinked, stunned into silence. My son looked away, unable to meet my eyes. 'Cause they knew. They both knew. Money could be rebuilt, lawsuits could be filed, schemes could be plotted. But once trust is broken, once a mother turns her back, there is no repair, no fix, only an emptiness that grows wider every day. The door creaked open again, and the lawyer returned, holding a smaller envelope this time. He walked past them without a glance, placed the envelope gently on my lap and said, "Keep this safe. Contains the final measure. If they push any further, this will end it." Their eyes widened. "What's in there?" my son demanded. The lawyer ignored him. "What's in there?" he roared, lunging forward, but the lawyer held up a hand. "If you touch her again, I'll have security remove you in handcuffs. Try me." My son stopped. The envelope sat warm against my hands. I didn't even need to open it. Already knew. Inside was the one thing more powerful than their lies, more final than their threats. The clause. The secret clause in the will that barred anyone who contested it from receiving even a dime. They could scream, they could fight, they could drag me through the mud. But every motion, every appeal, every attack would only tighten the noose around their own necks. And I only had to wait. As the lawyer left again, I turned back to them. Their faces were pale, their bravado slipping like masks melting in fire. For the first time they looked smaller to me. Two people who thought they were giants but were nothing more than children playing with stolen matches. "Go home," I said quietly. They didn't move. "Go home," I repeated louder this time, steel cutting through my voice. This time they listened. They gathered their coats, their pride in shreds, and shuffled toward the door. My son glanced back one last time, his lips parting as though to speak, but no words came. He lowered his head and followed his wife out. The door clicked shut, and just like that, the weight lifted. I leaned back against the pillows, the envelope still safe in my hands, and let out a long, steady breath. My chest ached, but my heart felt lighter than it had in years. For the first time I realized, I wasn't the one trapped. I wasn't the one losing. I had won. Not because I kept the money. Not because I outsmarted them. But because I had finally shown them that no matter how perfectly they thought their plan was built, one truth, one folder, one mother's silence was enough to bring it all crashing down. And as I closed my eyes, I whispered to myself, barely louder than a sigh. They thought their plan was perfect, until I reminded them who they were dealing with. The days that followed were quiet. Strangely quiet. You would think that after a storm like that, after the folder, after the shouting, after the lawyer's words, there would be endless noise. Phone calls, bangs on my door. Red, please. Maybe even tears. But instead there was silence. I sat in my room at the nursing home, watching the world move slowly through the window. The snow outside melted into patches of slush, the bare trees swayed in the wind, and occasionally, I'd see a nurse hurry past with a clipboard in her hand. It was in that stillness that I found myself remembering. I remembered my son as a boy, his chubby hands reaching for mine. I remembered the first time he called me Mama. I remembered when he broke his arm falling out of a tree and cried into my shirt until his hiccups faded. I remembered when he promised. Oh yes, he promised that he would always take care of me when I got old. Funny, isn't it, how promises made in childhood are so easily buried under greed in adulthood? But the silence didn't last long. On the third day the phone rang. It was the lawyer. "They filed an appeal," he said flatly. Smiled. "Of course they did. And," he continued, "they triggered the clause." Closed my eyes. Clause. The very one tucked into that envelope, waiting like a sleeping snake. They hadn't even realized that every step they took would only coil it tighter around their own throats. "What happens now?" "Yes. Now," he said, "they lose everything. Not just their share of the will. Everything." I let his words sink in. Everything. The $1 million estate they dreamed of. The properties they had already bragged about to their friends. The inheritance they thought they could manipulate me into surrendering. They had gambled on my weakness. And they had lost. Later that week my son showed up again. Alone this time. His wife had sent him, I suppose, too humiliated to come herself. He looked thinner. His suit was wrinkled, his hair messy. His eyes ringed with dark circles. He sat down in the chair across from me, and for a long moment we just stared at each other. "Why?" he finally whispered. I tilted my head. "Why what? Why would you do this to me?" I almost laughed. Almost. But my voice came out steady. "I didn't do this to you. You did this to yourself." His eyes brimmed with tears. But even then, I could see it wasn't sorrow for me. It wasn't regret for the way he had treated me. It was sorrow for himself. For the life he thought he was entitled to but would never have. "You don't understand," he said desperately. "I had plans. Big plans. I could have doubled that money in a year. I could have." I held up my hand. "Stop." His mouth snapped shut. "Do you hear yourself?" Yes. "Even now, even after losing everything, all you can think about is money. Plans. Investments. Doubling your wealth. Tell me, son, when was the last time you thought about me? About your mother? About the woman who raised you, sacrificed for you, believed in you?" He opened his mouth, but no words came. "That's the tragedy," I whispered. "Not the money. Not the will. The tragedy is that you forgot love. And once love is gone, nothing else matters." He lowered his head into his hands and wept. For a brief moment I wanted to reach out, to touch his shoulder, to comfort him the way I used to when he was a boy. But my hand froze in the air. 'Cause I remembered. I remembered the papers he had signed, forcing me into this home. I remembered the smug grin on his wife's face when she told me, "It's for your own good." I remembered the laughter they shared as they walked away, proud of their perfect plan. My hand dropped back into my lap. "I'm sorry," I said, and I meant it, but not for the reasons he thought. "I'm sorry you lost yourself along the way." He left without another word. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, and for the first time in years I felt free. Free from fear. Free from manipulation. Free from their control. They had tried to bury me, but all they'd done was teach me how to rise. The news spread quickly after that. The rest of the family found out what had happened. And oh, the calls I received. Some relatives praised me. "You showed them. You're stronger than all of us." Others scolded me. "You should have forgiven him, he's still your son." But none of their words mattered, because I had finally done something for me. And do you know the sweetest part? The money I kept, the money they thought they deserved, went exactly where they never expected. I donated most of it. To schools. To shelters. To causes that mattered. Causes that cared. Their greedy hands would never touch it. But the world would feel it. Months later, I heard they had sold their house. Downsized. Struggled. That their so-called friends abandoned them once they realized there was no inheritance to mooch from. And I sat in my chair, bathed in sunlight, sipping tea and smiled. Because they had thought their plan was perfect. Because they had looked so proud of themselves. Because they had laughed as they shoved me aside. But in the end, all it took was one folder. One phone call. One mother who refused to break. And I had the last word.